Hello, this is a film about a family, the Wagner family. They ruled this theatre in Bayreuth for 130 years. It holds 2,000 people, has a 5-week run, and more than 1 million people apply for tickets. And it's famous, in the best sense of the word, all over the world. It was built and created by Richard Wagner, the greatest composer of the 19th century, whose anti-Semitism is still unforgivable. The Wagner family has held on to this place through lies and deceptions and political intrigues for all that time. And that's what this film is about. It's made by Tony Palmer. When I started the South Bank show, I wanted the best film directors, arts film directors, to come and work on it. Tony Palmer was already one of those. The first film he made, Benjamin Britten, won ITV's First Prix Italia. He repeated the trick the next year with a film on Walton. He's done films with us on Fontaine and Berlioz and many, many others. There's sometimes been blood on the walls when we work together, but there's never been any doubt of the impact of his films and the strength and profundity of his artistic commitment. This is The Wagner Family by Tony Palmer.
Falsifying the truth is unfortunately part of the history of the Wagner family. It started with Richard Wagner himself. When you just see the first biographical sketches, then you start that, oh my goodness, he is just falsifying history. He himself, he started that. Then Cosima, the second wife, she became worse. 70 letters were burned by Cosima to his mistress, Mathilde von Wesendonck, which have an enormous importance for Wagner's work, including Tristan and Isolde. Bayreuth was, until spring 1933, a private business, the Wagner family business. And then it became a foundation. The Wagner family played in German and European, not only in the German history, quite a dark role. And you're building up even new Bayreuth on the ground of lies and falsification. The principle of power, abusing their position to not open up the archives of the Richard Wagner Foundation. And this was public, They did always hide that. So falsification starts with Richard Wagner, with Cosima. My grandmother, of course, with Winifred, with the denazification, and then the 57 years of New Bayreuth. It was never, ever really a real working through history, family and German history, and the closest connection. So this never has been done in a serious way. Wagner himself left in Bayreuth clear political message, not only for Germany, but for the rest of the world. Cosima, who ran the Bayreuth Festival till 1907, attracted all the most radical anti-Semite, chauvinistic people all over Germany, and not only Germany. Like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was English. And by the way, is a far distant cousin related to the other Chamberlain. But then marrying one of the daughters of Richard Wagner and Cosima Wagner, the connection with the Wagner family became very close. So we have his standard work, which became a bestseller for Germany. There were 43 different editions. He came when Parsifal was first presented. He was already a racist. He immediately, in combination with Parsifal, he became the chief dramaturg of the Bayreuth Festival.
The subject matter of Parsifal is racial purity. Wagner sees the entire German nation in disarray and its vital strength being drained by foreigners. And the whole purpose of Parsifal was to explain Wagner's concept of how the Aryan race might be restored.
Deutschland begeht in den Festspielen 1938 den 125. Geburtstag Richard Wagners.
Hitler saw this very, very clearly. Parsifal, he said, was the meaningful opera for him. And of course, it is the codification of Wagner's racial theories. What Wagner did was very, very dangerous because his work, his mind, contributed to a dreadful turn of events. Hitler's racial theory owes so much to Wagner that it's very hard to separate one from the other. Hitler at times adopts Wagnerian prose so that his style is Wagnerian and his vocabulary is Wagnerian.
Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich habe die anderen genauso vernichtet.
Parsifal has nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity as preached by the Roman Catholic Church or any of the major Protestant churches, nothing at all. People believe that they're going to an Easter experience, but it has nothing to do with Easter. Because he uses the communion service. He does really a black mass on stage. He takes the communion service and gives it a new text. People still are under what Wagner thought was this terrible era that Christ was a Jew. The man who wrote Judaism in music in the 50s said there was a possibility for Jews to become human beings. But by the time he reissued his pamphlet, Judaism in Music, in 1869, he said it was impossible.
So Wagner develops in other 14 writings plural, in his so-called Bayreuth beliefs, Bayreuther Blätter, his very aggressive, one side, anti-Semitic, chauvinistic Weltanschauung. This one has to know, to understand also what it means, Richard Wagner in Bayreuth.
Parsifal has an open meaning. Maybe Wagner knew, but it was often misinterpreted. That's why the Nazis, because of the blood motif, wanted a final interpretation. There's a wonderful letter from Goebbels. The Nazis will come to a conclusion, he says, after the final victory, when the Führer will make a decisive statement about the meaning of Parsifal so that it can be performed correctly forever.
There's a writing where Wagner has the vision of a Germany free of Jews, Judenfrei, which is appalling for us.
And then came my grandmother, Winifred.
Ich bin 1897 von britischen Eltern in Hastings.
I was born in 1897. Of British parents in Hastings. Sadly, both my parents died before I was 2, and so, aged 4, I found myself sent to Germany.
Plötzlich nach Deutschland geschickt wurde.
Married to the 54-year-old Wagner's son, this young woman was lonely. And when Hitler had attempted to seize power in Munich and the putsch had failed, there was a great commotion. Their very good friend was missing. And then she heard he was in Landsberg prison.
I asked what he needed. He said lots of writing paper, so I sent a whole load of paper from our house, Villa Wanfried. And my God, now people tell me I supplied the paper for Hitler to write Mein Kampf, almost as if I am responsible for Mein Kampf being written. I called him Wolf, and he called me Winnie. We had a very close relationship, as did the children. They all called him Wolf as well. It was a purely human and private relationship.
Und vertrauliche Bindung zwischen uns.
I must confess he made a very deep impression on me. As a personality, his eyes were especially attractive, very blue, large and expressive. And I asked him to our house, Villa Wanfried, after I learnt he was very interested and knowledgeable about Wagner, and he wanted to see Wagner's house and his grave. So I said to him, come to us tomorrow. Yes, he said, but tomorrow I must go to Berlin. But you've got to have breakfast somewhere, so just come for breakfast. And then he appeared the next day, it was in 1923, and stayed for breakfast. And afterwards, my husband showed him around the house.
She always said very proudly, yes, I was so close. And
so, for example,
a hospital was constructed, and this was called in honor to Winifred Wagner House. And there was a kind of an Aryan breeding going on. That means German pure, in the sense of the Nazi philosophy, blonde heroes should create with blonde, typical Nordic women, the master race, and that so close to the Festspielhaus.
Wir gehörten mit zu denen, die unentwegt an den Führer glaubten, an die nationalsozialistische Idee glaubten und haben, ich kann wirklich sagen, durch dick und dünn zu ihm gestanden.
So listen, Omi, as she was called, by the grandchildren, this is unsupportable. You cannot say, you cannot blame only the close collaborators of Hitler who did it behind Hitler. So that's not true. And Hans Frank, who was one of the closest friends, even of the Wagner family, Hans Frank, the general governor of occupied Poland and responsible also for Auschwitz, he had even a love affair with the gouvernante of the 4 children of Winifred. She was a militant Nazi herself, and she was responsible for the education for Wieland, Friedelind, Wolfgang, and Verena. So when she came to the point of Auschwitz, and I said, grandmother, stop that. It's too much. So she said, but this is only the invention, by certain cycles, and then especially again referring to New York Jews. She had always this idea, there's the world conspiracy comes from Wall Street and the Jews. No? So she had her obsessions and did not even accept she lived in her dream world. So she wanted to have Hitler always as the man coming from the Holy Grail, bringing light to Bayreuth and the rest of the world. From May 1944, there was constructed a branch of concentration camp Flossenburg, which was in Bayreuth.
Winifred's elder son,
Wieland Wagner, was for this period, in combination with his brother-in-law, Bodo Lafferenz, who was also a very fiery Nazi, married to the younger daughter of Winifred, Verena. They made this kind of chemical experiments, but sometimes, of course, with dangerous stuff. So there are descriptions of those slave workers who have done this. Bodo Lafferenz did the organization Kraft durch Freude, Strength by Joy, and all the soldiers were obliged to go to the Bayreuth Festival before having the honor to die for the Führer, for the final victory. So this is also a very macabre situation, like a black mass. You go as a religious service to Bayreuth, believing in the superiority, and then going to Eastern Europe and fight, still having the music of Richard Wagner in the ear. Even in March 1945, the world was burning. The Holocaust, World War II was going on the rest, and he was controlling, this concentration camp of Flossenburg, Bayreuth for 1 year. And he wanted to make a new
Bayreuth Festival.
So these kind of constellations, these contexts, certainly were hidden. especially the one of Wieland in Flossenburg, till 1987. This did not come out.
Also für mich war wirklich der Großschock.
And for me, the big shock was the film which Sieberberg made about my grandmother in 1975. It's great that it was made. I was in Munich and went to see it in a local cinema. And I watched these 5 hours in a small cinema in shock. Total shock.
Shock. Total shock.
I always had these pictures in my head of Winifred, Omi we called her, sitting all day long at her typewriter. And one Christmas I saw her carrying a load of presents in a washing basket. Then I said to her, Omi, who are all these presents for? And she said, for those poor pigs in the East Zone.
During her denazification, my grandmother was preaching aggressively, you know, I'm innocent, I did my duty, what the hell do they want? I did never wrong. And people even applauded in the hall. But the trial was faked. I mean, Winifred said, oh my goodness, this American officer, also a Jew, no, silly man, he thinks that I would give him the real stuff, no? And then she made always parties, April 20th, which is Hitler's birthday. So she sent the cards, you know, and then wonderful, I'm so happy to invite you for special remembrance, no, of USA, unser seliger Adolf. That was not the United States of America, but it was our blessed Adolf. And then she signed with 88, which is the 8th letter in the alphabet, which is H, Heil Hitler.
Mein Sohn hat sich in vielen
My son has spoken out so negatively about the current administration of the festival in all those public lectures he gives. And especially that he has declared that my colleagues and fellow workers just pretend to be sympathetic to Jews, and that I am also following negative National Socialist tendencies. This is such a preposterous and monstrous and false accusation. And moreover, it's an insult to me and my staff that it is absolutely impossible for this to be allowed to continue. So he can't have any tickets. That's right. I can't accept him as a guest because of my staff. If he speaks so negatively about them and attacks everybody, including me, in such a negative way, that he simply cannot be allowed into the theatre anymore.
Angreift und behandelt, dass der hier in dem Haus sein kann.
Just take his autobiography. There's a statement when he says, when Wieland and I took over in 1951, we had not the slightest need to put ashes on our hair because we were much too young, you know, and we had no responsibility. They saw in the 30s and 40s so much more than the rest of the world. They knew about Auschwitz. They knew about what was going on in the rest of the world. So when he says that, proclaiming we are completely innocent, no, I'm not blaming my father for that when he was this young man. But when he writes a biography as a man of 75 years, then he has to put all on the table and write about it, and also in a certain way coming to the point where at least saying, oh, I'm so sorry. I mean, you know, 60 million dead people, that's too much.
When the Great Theatre in Bayreuth was built in 1876, Wagner had 5 children. His only son, Siegfried, 2 daughters from Cosima's marriage to Hans von Bülow, and 2 with Cosima. 1 definitely, Eva, who later married Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and 1 maybe, called Isolde, my grandmother, named after the heroine of his opera Tristan and Isolde. after Wagner's death, Cosima forced her ex-husband, at that time her ex-husband von Bülow, to declare that Siegfried was Wagner's son, which meant to be the only heir. All the other children were excluded now from the Wagner heritage. But you don't need a DNA test to see that Isolde is a Wagner. And she was the one who also dared to contradict Cosima. Finally, Isolde decided to sue her mother to establish her true lineage. Cosima considered that blackmail. And the Cosima is not going to be blackmailed, even if it's her family. Isolde lost the case. The verdict of 1914 is legal up to today. So the consequence was that Isolde was expelled from Bayreuth. Isolde suffered tremendously. It's probably the saddest thing that could happen. And so actually, you're talking to someone who is legally von Bülow, and I'm expecting your next film on the Bülow branch or whatever you say.
But how and why did Winifred, my grandmother, come into these contexts?
Das Kind war ein Waisenkind und man wusste nicht,
She was an orphan, as we have seen. When her parents died, as she had no relatives in England, she was put into an orphanage.
Da hat diese kleine Winifred dann auch sehr...
And their little Winifred had big problems with her health.
Das fing also an mit so einer...
She had a kind of nervous dermatitis, eczema.
Die also sehr lästig war, mit so Ekzemen auch, die sie hatte, also ganz schwierig.
They couldn't tolerate that in the orphanage, probably because it was just too much work. So the people running the orphanage began to look for any relative to take her away.
Vom Waisenhaus wirklich sehr, sehr...
As there was no one in England, and as they knew she had very, very distant relatives in Germany, so they wrote to them. And these were the Klindworth. Klindworth was a famous pianist, old enough to have actually known Richard Wagner personally. In fact, had done all the piano reductions of the operas. And when Winifred was 17, an invitation arrived to go to Bayreuth. Mrs. Klindworth was sick, so Klindworth took the young Winifred. And during one of the tea intervals with the family all said, pretty girl. Siegfried apparently didn't notice.
Wäre schon etwas, denn sie brauchten ja vor allem...
But all the aunts were saying, that would be great, because they needed a young girl for the not-so-young Siegfried, so that she could quickly become pregnant.
Das war ja der Grund.
They desperately needed him to have a child. None of the four sisters had any children, and nor did Siegfried, because he was homosexual.
Keine Kinder, weil ja ein Schwuler war. Das war ja jetzt sein Problem.
That was the problem. He absolutely had to have a child, otherwise the dynasty would become extinct.
Die Dynastie der Wagners völlig ausgestorben gewesen.
Meine Großmutter fand, dass also junge Frauen
My grandmother thought that all young women should be kept busy, and so she told her to do the dusting in the big room, to clean the books nicely, and so on. Although she spoke German and even French, you could tell from her accent then that she was English. So every day she would have German lessons with Cosima, and also read to her every day. It was not true that the old woman was blind, although I'm sure she had bad eyesight. She was very sensitive to light and always lay in her couch away from the light. But we children could go to her whenever we wanted, and we really took advantage of that, because she was incredibly humorous and played jokes with us, and we were allowed to climb all over her bed. We could do her hair. We could dress her up, anything we wanted.
But already in 1923, when Verena was only 2, my grandmother had fallen in love with Adolf Hitler.
Der Zusammenbruch im Jahre 23, im November 23, haben wir ganz unmittelbar miterlebt. Der 8. November sollte ja der Auftakt zur nationalen Revolution und zur nationalen Umkehr werden. Und es war ein großes Festkonzert in München geplant, am Abend des 8. bzw. am 9. November, bei dem mein Mann dirigieren sollte. Wir waren also in München und erlebten doch den Zusammenbruch und all das Tragische, was es zunächst mal mit sich brachte.
Siegfried died in 1930, only a few weeks after his mother Cosima.
Man muss wissen, dass die Winifred als 18...
We mustn't forget that Winifred was only 18 when she married my grandfather, who was already over 50. So it's clear that the much younger Hitler was somehow her dream. He was also the guy with power. And she soon was introducing Hitler to her children as Papa. There was certainly discussion about my grandmother marrying Hitler. She wanted to, undoubtedly, but Adolf said she could not divorce my grandfather in order to marry Hitler.
Fridolin Wagner was the second child of Siegfried and Winifred. The children were fascinated by this man. He used to come in the nights when he secretly travelled to Bayreuth, when he came upstairs and showed them his pistol and told them stories. He often invited them to Berlin, and they went there with a special train, and she was fascinated, as the rest of the people were too.
Bayreuth was just for him a good cover. He always said that the world press would see him in Bayreuth and think he was there just because he loved Wagner. But behind the scenes in our home, many political decisions were made. The bombing of Spain, the invasion of Poland using my brother's geography book, the assassination of the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss, and all while the world was not watching.
I mean, of course, she was very privileged by Hitler. He gave the family money, and he enabled them to travel to all sorts of places. So it was a difficult thing for her to do the opposite. I mean, when you think of her older brother, Wieland, he was up to 1945. He believed in Hitler, and so did Wolfgang, and Verena certainly too. So I think it was quite an extraordinary thing for her to turn against him. 1st of September 1939, where the Germans invaded Poland, and this, I think, was the last straw for Fridolin. She now decided she was going to leave Germany for good.
It was one of the greatest scandals that the closeness to Uncle Wolf, the daughter of Winifred, she certainly threatened her very strongly, you have to come back, that she will be even executed when she does not come back to Germany. And there were contacts, as we know, with Himmler. So this is absolutely true. Sometimes it's denied. Unfortunately, or this kind of falsification of the brothers.
She did broadcasts in the States, mostly about Hitler and defending her grandfather Wagner.
Deutsche Hörer, ich habe Deutschland nicht leichthin verlassen und bin erst fortgegangen, als die mörderischen Absichten des augenblicklichen deutschen Regimes klar am Tage lagen. Und selbst dann noch habe ich mich gefragt, wie würde mein Großvater, wie würde Richard Wagner gehandelt haben an meiner Stelle? Wäre er geblieben, Richard Wagner, der die Freiheit und die Gerechtigkeit mehr geliebt hat als selbst die Musik, hätte in Hitlers Deutschland nicht atmen können.
Winifred was shocked about this, of course. She got a letter from a Nazi saying, would you please explain why your daughter is doing this? And she did her best to say, my daughter has been influenced by Jewish people. And she was eager to explain that it was not her own free will, which of course was nonsense.
In February
1945, when we came here to Nostov by Lake Constance, our mother gave us the scores of Tristan and Parsifal, as well as the whole of the Wagner list correspondence. The point was that the archive should be dispersed, so that if a bomb or the enemy had destroyed something, other things would survive. First, we buried the scores here in the garden. They were well wrapped in my children's nappies, and then wrapped in leather and sealed with wax. Then we buried them out there during a foggy night, because we had lodgers and we didn't want them to notice what we were doing and report us.
I
admit that everything that happened in the last half of the war I totally reject. But I will not pour out the baby with the bathwater, and I insist that what I considered good and humane about Hitler remains true.
Gut und menschlich an dem Mann gehalten habe, das lasse ich mir einfach nicht nehmen.
And I will not be untrue to this memory. I mean, he had such a unique personality that I would not have wanted to miss that experience.
Nicht missen möchte.
She was a monster, an iron lady, a harsh mother, a domineering character within the family. There was no human closeness, no warmth, no real understanding. And one mustn't forget that she was still relatively young when, at aged only 50, her reign over Bayreuth was, as a result of her Nazi past, and she certainly felt this way, taken from her unfairly and given to her sons. What happened was that her authority, her power, was taken away from her. Who could she dominate now? So her wish to dominate was now focused on her family, and so she destroyed it.
The auditorium was built like a great wooden platform. It has no real foundations whatsoever. Underneath, it's completely hollow. And the ceiling is very similar. On the outside, the ceiling has been plastered. But up there, once again, it's completely hollow. It's not a real ceiling as we understand it. In fact, there are two ceilings with a vacuum in the middle, so that the sound in between just vibrates. Like the body of a violin. Yes, like the body of a violin. So always, as a director or as a musician, you have to figure out the relation between the sound from the stage and the sound from the orchestra, because the orchestra is in fact invisible, and so the audience feels it is in the middle of the sound.
Zum 75-jährigen Jubiläum der Bayreuther Festspiele, nach 10-jähriger Unterbrechung. Schon seit Wochen sind die Karten für den Zyklus in alle Welt ausverkauft. Der Theaterfundus des Festspielhauses musste neu aufgebaut werden, nachdem der alte Bestand an Kostümen in den Nachkriegsmonaten geplündert und zerstreut wurde. Am Regietisch die beiden Enkel Richard Wagners, Wieland und Wolfgang.
Wieland was a central figure. He renovated the theater, and that was very important. How we went to kind of this reactionary environment, so to speak, when he was very young. I mean, when he was 14, 16, he was living in a terrible environment. How he did get rid of that within 6 years, from 45 to 51. He transformed totally himself in somebody very important and very capital even in the development of Bayreuth.
Ich habe primär ja niemals vorgehabt, zu schockieren.
I never intended my productions primarily to shock. My Ring staging had an echo in the world press and also with our international audience. But I must remind you that my original staging was roundly booed. My second staging, 6 years after the first, was booed even more, before eventually it found some success.
I mean, this is the royal family of Germany. There is nothing like Bayreuth. This is absolutely the top. But he couldn't cope he couldn't live a private life, really. And that marriage also to Gertrud at that young age was just an escape from that strong mother.
And Winifred was always sending letters everywhere, rubbishing my mother Gertrude and describing Anja as the whore of the Kurfürstendamm.
The weight of the family. I mean, the father being actually homosexual was a big problem for him. He was always fearing that he becomes homosexual himself, and he was always trying to escape himself from the beginning on. And he also always said, you know, I never wanted to live. I don't want to live. I don't like me. He always tried to be faithful, to go back to the family, and he never made it. Because he loved me, and I loved him deeply. I think he never dealt with anything very deep inside. He never spoke about the time of Hitler, of course. But that is, I think he died from that he never really let out what he carried with him inside. When he opened a little bit, that was then like a tumor. It just became bigger and bigger. And I'm pretty sure he died of that.
Das war während der Festspiele 66.
He was taken ill during the 1966 festival.
Wir wissen es nicht, Problem, und hat ihn dann hier
He had to interrupt his rehearsals, and we didn't know what the problem was. And then he was taken to the hospital in the Nussbaumstraße.
Es ging ihm schlecht, und da
and while he was there, he began spitting blood. He felt very sick, and that's when they realized he had cancer, which meant he had a growth between the lungs and the heart. And the doctors would never tell us exactly what was going on, although I think they knew precisely.
Genau, was los ist, obwohl die genau wussten, was los ist. Und das Schlimmste war für mich ein Satz, den etwas vorher sagte.
And the worst for me was a sentence that he said during my frequent visits to the hospital. He said once, "Children, I am glad to die."
Das ist ein fürchterlicher Satz.
That is a terrible sentence. And we believed him because we understood each other very well.
Organisch. Das war völlig einsichtig.
But to see the readiness to die in a person that one loves is horrible.
War entsetzlich. Hat ja auch
but he kept working, even in his hospital bed. There is undoubtedly a strong will to live, even in a terminally ill person.
Aber wir waren da, wir haben uns abgewechselt.
And we were there, Daphne and I, and followed his passage into death, as it were. We were in the same room as him, cuddled up on a sofa.
Sehr schlimm ist für mich die Erinnerung, Sie wissen, der Lungenkranke, der
Someone who is suffering from lung cancer croaks when he breathes in. We never knew, would this be his last breath? Or is there a next breath? And this breathing is life. Will he breathe once more?
Ja, es ist schrecklich.
It was horrible.
Es ist entsetzlich. Nun weißt du, nach dem Tod meines Vaters wurde Wolfgang Wagner.
After the death of my father, his younger brother Wolfgang, my uncle, became the boss. He had a right, therefore, to move into Warnfried, the family house. But he already had his own house where he had lived for a long time. So what did this mean for us? Wolfgang arrived to measure all the rooms where we lived, to work out what we should pay in rent. How high should the rent be? He knew very well that Wieland's widow, our mother, had no money. Indeed, there were enormous debts. We had all just started our studies. There was an obvious lack of money. We just couldn't afford any rent.
Wir konnten dafür keine Miete zahlen, das ist selbstverständlich. Also alles, als mein Vater gestorben war, hat ja nicht nur uns.
Wolfgang not only evicted us, but he then sacked all the people in the Festspielhaus connected to my father. He destroyed the scenery designed by my father, and worse, all the little models he had made. He burned the complete correspondence between my father and the various artists. And this time it wasn't a book burning, but a letter burning.
Wurde alles vernichtet, den gab's nicht.
It felt like a vendetta against the whole of Wieland's family.
Seiner Familie. Alles, was mit meinem Vater zu tun gehabt hat, wurde.
Everything that had to do with my father was hacked to pieces.
Die Leute, die noch mit meinem Vater zu tun hatten im Festspielhaus, die flogen ja alle raus.
He put my family out in the street, and later, when he himself took up with a younger woman, his own wife was thrown out. And his two children, Gottfried and Eva, found their nursery furniture and toys in the yard. He just said either pick them up or they will be sent to the rubbish tip. He did that even to his own children.
Also auch seinen Kindern gegenüber.
We spent the whole year preparing for the festival and employ full-time about 60 people. But during the festival, this grows to around 700. I would really like to work in the festival, not only in the artistic side, but also in the organization.
In the city of Bayreuth, the mayor banned me completely, and nothing has changed until today. The three mayors of Bayreuth, they declared me as someone who is insane, no? Which shows a lot of them. It's their problem, not my problem, you know? So, it's, I mean, for me, and this was never, they never apologized for that.
Was heißt denn Familie? Familie ist.
What does my family mean? Forgive me for asking. What is this family? Family is just a random collection of people who happen to share the same name, okay. But to justify being a member of that family, you have to do something more than just share the name.
Dann eine Aussage hat.
Sein Wille war ganz dezidiert, die Geschichte.
His will was clearly to rewrite history, as if Wieland had never existed. Now I'm here, he said. I can make productions at least as good as my brothers, and historically, they won't be able to prove otherwise, because there's nothing left. It was a brutal change of regime. Now it's my turn. Out with you lot. He even cancelled our resident registration in Bayreuth. It became more and more like a police state, and although he stopped short of fingerprinting, everything was now thoroughly regulated. Forbidden, forbidden, forbidden.
Verboten, verboten, verboten. Wieland war der Böse und war auch nicht der Künstler. Wenn ist
Wieland was portrayed as the baddie, never the artist, as Hitler's favorite child with his private concentration camp in Bayreuth, which is totally mad.
Absolut.
Over the years, the legacy of my father has simply been destroyed.
Wird einfach so eine Figur demontiert.
I cannot allow the Bayreuth Festival to simply become the plaything of the descendants of Richard Wagner. I can only use them if I believe they are doing something for Bayreuth. That's what's really important. We are not simply a training school for Wagner's great-grandchildren.
Wir sind hier keine Ausbildungsstätte für Wagner-Urenkel.
And then, when my father, Wolfgang, abandoned my mother and married his second wife, Gudrun, the trouble really started.
Die Wieland-Kinder und die Wolfgang-Kinder haben sich ja.
Eventually, the children of both Wieland and Wolfgang united against this Gudrun, and that his own children were chucked out.
It's a brutality from the side of Wolfgang, which is incredible. Ja, das ist But he treated them the same way as he treated the children of his brother. So he's the same man. It happens very often that men who marry young women, they grow older, they get weaker, and the other one gets the feeling of power more and more. And the old man, I mean, I've seen film excerpts where the couple is being filmed. And the way she looks and she treats the old man is so disgusting.
Die war furchtbar, die war irgendwie krankhaft, Meshuggah war die.
She was terrible, pathological, and nymphomaniac. I knew her well. Oh my God, I said. What is happening to her? Oh yes, she's drunk today. She always had a hangover. She organized the festival really well, one must say that. But at the end, she developed a very grey skin. She was never a beauty, but she managed to get all those men, they said. First the singers and then the chorus. But that took a little longer.
Bis sie den durch hatte, war wirklich schlimm.
Habe ich die Wut der Wolfgang Wagner Kinder.
I can well understand the anger of Wolfgang's children. That their father married this woman, the most hated person in the whole artistic world, even with the politicians. Politicians are not themselves of the finest quality, but even for them, Gudrun was impossible. Her style and the way she represented the Bayreuth Festival. But incredibly, although Gudrun was there for over 30 years, less than 2 years after her death, she's been completely forgotten.
Die Frau ist weg und vergessen.
57 Jahre hatte Wolfgang das Zepter fest in der Hand. Vor ein paar Tagen wurde der Festspielleiter mit der längsten Amtszeit aller Zeiten gebührend verabschiedet und nun gibt er die Leitung an seine Nachfolger ab. Gemeinsam mit ihrer Halbschwester Eva Wagner-Pasquier und soll Katharina das Erbe ihres Urgroßvaters bewahren.
Wissen Sie, es ist einfach ein Wahnsinn. You know, it's been an incredible roller coaster for us. There's nothing we can do about it except soldier on. It's not been much fun, nor that the decisions have gone in the way they have. And quite simply, we are now both exhausted.
In a few years, how would you like your regime to be remembered?
I don't know if you can really define your legacy in just a few years. I think it normally takes a bit longer, but certainly quality.
Our successors will know.
I cannot imagine that this works. I cannot. That will not work. I don't know how. That is a mistake. That is a mistake. Naja, what can we do? This is what it is now. Such a great festival.
Bayreuth eine Art Nationalsymbol ist.
Bayreuth is a national symbol. All society wants to be there, and this gives to whoever is the director power, or the politics of power, or the drunkenness of power. And if everyone is still kneeling in front of the grandson's words, this position of power is being abused. It's really all about who has the power, and whatever the cost, keeping it.
Das macht diese Machtposition aus.
To reform an own identity. And this always had to do also with a very critical confrontation with the heritage, you know, left by Wagner already himself and the Wagner family in the Third Reich. So who are we then as Germans and Wagners after Hitler? Can you be proud to be a Wagner?